Today is January 22nd, 2023, and this is the 23rd year anniversary of my mom's death. She died down in Costa Rica, and I actually didn't learn about it for about 2 days. I'll tell you about that in just a bit. But, you know, I got to thinking about this. I saw a Facebook memory that was a reminder, and I was like, oh yeah, it's that day again. Because in the Facebook memory I said, if it wasn't for Facebook reminding me, I would have forgotten about this, because it's always at the busiest time of the year when the semester is underway and all sorts of other things are happening. But here it is once again every year. And this is kind of an interesting one. You know, she died in 2000, very early on, so just across you could say the threshold of the new millennium. And she was 53 when she died. If she'd lived till April, she would have been 54. I'm going to be turning 53 this year myself, and so there's a long distance. And I thought I would do some reflection, sort of like what I did in the video about growing up, you know, without my dad, because he died when I was 11 and he was only 36. But this is a little bit different because I got to know my mom quite a bit in my, let's call it my early adult life. And I probably, just as with my dad, would have benefited considerably having them around much longer. And of course, it would have been good for them as well. They missed out on a lot of opportunities, getting to see, you know, my kids, getting to meet, you know, my wife, and you know, getting to know her and her family and all of that sort of stuff. So, you know, I've got a bunch of reflections here, but I should probably tell a bit of the story, and I should also make a clarification that'll be necessary for some people. So when I say my mom, I mean Monique Sadler, who was born Monique Claudette Lemrise and then married my dad, Anton Sadler, when they met while both of them were in college. She was at DePaul down in Chicago, one of the first people in her family to go to college, and she met him up at UW-Madison. She dropped out, they got married. They couldn't have kids, even though they tried, and so they adopted me, and then later on they adopted my sister from a different family. She's about 2.5 years younger than me. And when I say mom and dad, I mean my adoptive parents, because they were the ones I grew up with, and I was quite fortunate in who I got, because, you know, my dad was a great guy, my mom was a great woman, and her larger Lemrise family was very important in my life and my sister's life and our development and all of that. I do have, you know, a biological mother and father, and I'm in touch with my biological father. I was in touch with my biological mother for a long time, and what I can say is, holy crap, am I glad that she gave me up for adoption, because my life is so much better having had the parents that I did. The only drawback was, of course, that they died so young. So with my mom, what ended up happening was I was down in Southern Illinois. I was in graduate school, living in a trailer park, you know, paying pretty cheap rent. And I got a call from the U.S. consulate in Costa Rica. And you know, back then, you didn't have phones that actually told you who it was or anything like that. So I answer the phone, and it's the middle of a cold winter. And, you know, they said, are you Gregory Sadler? And you know, it's a woman on the end of the phone, and she was, I think, the consul, or perhaps, you know, the sub-consul or somebody like that. And she said, well, I've got some unfortunate news for you. There was a terrible rafting accident, and your mother is dead. And we've got her remains, and we need to know what you want us to do. And she was down in Costa Rica. They were on a rafting trip, and it was her and 5 other people, including her boyfriend at the time, her live-in boyfriend. And the river was swollen from rains. Nobody really should have been on the river. There were all sorts of things in the background. This company that they were going with had been previously written up for safety violations. My mom that day, we know from her travel log that she did not want to go on the river that day, and we also knew this from one of her friends who she'd confided in. Her boyfriend insisted, and there was an accident, and not only she died, but another person drowned as well. And my mom's boyfriend, his son was on the trip. He got a broken arm, and they were in the middle of the jungle. So the Red Cross had to go in and recover the bodies and help the others who were pretty busted up as well. And it took an entire day to get them out of the jungle. So imagine some Red Cross person with, my mom, and there was another person, a guy who died, strapped to their backs, carrying them out of the jungle down trails. And, the consul said, listen, we're going to issue some death certificates to you. You're going to need them for all the things that you're going to have going on in the next, week, months ahead. And we're going to have to cremate her because there's no way we're shipping a body, from Costa Rica all the way up to Wisconsin. The embalming processes down here are a bit different than they are in the States. And I was like, yeah, that sounds quite reasonable. And so then I was like, I got off the phone and I was people say, oh, you're in shock or something like that. And I'd imagine to myself, what would I do hearing the news of my mom dying? And I pictured myself like, knocking books off the shelf or something like that. And it didn't happen. Instead, I was like, well, what am I going to do? And I had a girlfriend at the time who had a working vehicle, because otherwise I would have had to immediately get on the Greyhound and go up north. My mom had recently bought a new house. She'd been living in a place called Menominee Falls for quite a while. She sold that and bought a house in Brookfield in a fairly nice subdivision. I'd been there a few times. And, we'd had a family Christmas there at one point. And so I knew I had to get up there. So we pile into my girlfriend's not quite SUV, one of those kind of little hybrid things that had a canvas top and all that. And we get on the road for the 7-hour trip up to my mom's house in Brookfield, and it was super cold. We had blankets along, fortunately, and I was just kind of, thinking, well, what happened, and what do I need to do next? My younger sister, was, I think, 6 months pregnant at the time, and I don't remember if she was married or not. I think maybe she was to her. The guy that she was seeing at the time, who she, later on got divorced from. And I knew she wasn't going to be any help whatsoever. But they didn't have quite so far to go. They were just up in the Fox cities, so maybe an hour and a half drive. So it's, by the time that we get there, I got the call in the morning, and what I remember is getting there and it being dark and, finding the key. I forget exactly where it was stored, like in under a little owl statue or something like that, and getting inside. And, then my mom had bought these 2 little tiny pug cats, and they came running up, and, they're wondering who we were. And, we get in and start unpacking and just going through stuff. There was so much to do. All these people in the family to call and let know what was going on. I didn't have a cell phone at the time because I wasn't, rich or anything or a techie. And, I was calling from my mom's place. And, then in the following days, there were all these things to handle, including her boyfriend coming back, bringing the urn, acting like a jackass, lighting candles in the bathroom that caught a towel on fire. He was just kind of a hot mess, but he was always kind of a screw up. And then there were, my family, my mom's family started showing up and, sort of camping out. It was fortunate she had a big place with lots of rooms, and I started going through some of the paperwork, and there was all sorts of stuff to handle. And then we had to think about the funeral. And, I know I'm presenting this in kind of a disjointed fashion. I'm just remembering all the things at the time. So, one of my memories is of going to one of the local churches. And my mom, she had grown up Catholic. And then, she was in it when it was very doctrinaire and strict, the Baltimore Catechism days. And then we had Vatican II and things kind of opened up. And she had, been involved in the church for quite a while. And then, kind of strayed away, and so she wasn't a member of any of the parishes. She wasn't on the rolls. And I remember going to this church, and I was like, well, we'd like to have, a funeral mass for my mom. And the priest said, well, she's not on our parishioner rolls. And I was like, well, she's not on anyone else's parishioner rolls either. And you're the closest church. So what do you think they're going to say if I walk into there? Somebody's going to have to do this. Why not you? And that, convinced the priest, and they were able to do that, and we did the mass, we did the wake. It's interesting, too, because my mom at the time, she was working for Tombstone Pizza, which then got bought out by Kraft RJ Nabisco. And she, at one time she was working for the general manager, and then she started working in HR. And my mom was an incredibly outgoing, gregarious person, really the life of the party, a little bit manic as well, and a real go-getter, a real people person, as you say. So there were lots of people who came to the funeral from her work. And my family, I would say at least 100 people showed up from that, and then there were our local friends. But the bulk of the people were from the Vagabond Ski Club, which is an organization in the Milwaukee area, and there's probably vagabonds in other places as well. And it was basically for like middle class on upward people who were widowed or divorced or things like that. And they did ski, but they also did all sorts of other things as well, vacations and, trips to different places. And it just so happened that at the time she was the secretary for the club. And so word got out, and I would say about 1,000 of those people showed up. And so the receiving line for the funeral, and this is all happening not on obviously the 22nd, but about a week later, really, we were there for 6 hours. We actually had to, at certain points, take a break, go off for 10 minutes. And a receiving line is, the immediate family. So, me and my girlfriend and my sister and her husband or boyfriend at the time, my aunts and uncles, my grandpa and grandma, and, we're all there, and people come up and they say their thing. The best people are the ones who just say, sorry for your loss, and then get the hell moving, right? You don't want to hear a big, long story about how they know your mom or something. And the Vagabond Ski people, a lot of them said crazy crap, like, oh, she's an angel in heaven looking down on you. Or, she's in a better place. And after a while, I was like, well, how the hell would you know that? I mean, if you actually believe in this stuff, she could be in heaven, she could be in hell. People don't become angels. At a certain point, I got kind of tired of that, especially when I heard this one crazy lady telling me about Elijah's twofold spirit and some crazy application to my mom's case. So, there was all that going on, and then we had to start looking at her retirement account, which paid out to my cousins, and the life insurance, and, there was a will. Interestingly, in her previous will, she had actually, because she knew how much I disliked her boyfriend, she had a proviso that I had to give him a certain amount of time before kicking him out of the house, right? It's clearly aimed at me, not at my sister, who was a bit more sanguine about those sorts of things, or rather passive. And in this case, you know, there wasn't anything about the new house. But, you know, there was a lawyer's names, the Chandicks, husband-wife team. So I looked them up and made an appointment with them. And I was like, you know, what happens next? I've never done this sort of thing before. And there was a lot to go on with that. And, you know, throughout all this, you know, there was the grieving, the thinking about what had happened. You know, her last moments, she drowned to death. We didn't know all the particulars about it. But, you know, it's interesting because she almost drowned to death just a few months before on another whitewater rafting trip. She was telling us about it at our family Christmas down in Indiana. And she was telling us this scary story about how, like, the raft flipped and she was stuck under a log, and she was thinking to herself, this might be it. And, you know, somebody pulled her out, and so she was saved. And we were like, this is really dangerous. Why are you doing this? Well, you know, she was always kind of a thrill seeker. She was always into adventure. I don't think she thought a lot of the time about the possible dangerous repercussions of things until after they happened. And so, you know, there's all that. And, you know, I'm almost the same age that she was when she died. And I think of myself as like being solidly within middle age. And it's interesting to look back on because that's where she was. And she was so active and vibrant and interested in everything. And then just cut right short. She didn't get to see even her oldest grandchild being born, my sister's child. She didn't get to see my kids. She never did finish up her college education. You know, she worked as a secretary for one of the deans at Alverno College for a while, and she was working on a degree there. And then she left and went to Marquette University, and she worked as a project secretary and took courses at Marquette. And I think, you know, at one point in time, she probably decided she wanted to just keep taking as many classes as possible. Because when she died, her Alverno credits, none of them transferred to Marquette because they have their own weird pass-fail system. So she started again at Marquette. When she died, she had more than enough credits to actually graduate. She'd actually changed her major several times, I think, in an effort to keep from graduating so she could keep on taking more and more college classes. Because, you know, you got a certain amount for free, and she loved studying. She loved learning. She loved talking about things. She was really an intellectually engaged person, as well as engaged in so many other ways. And so, you know, there's a lot of life that unfortunately she missed out on. I don't know. I mean, now she was born in 1946, so she would be in her, you know, late 70s at this point. Who knows what she would have accomplished? I do know that had she survived, I'm sure she would have really, you know, loved my kids, and you know, I'm sure that she would have really enjoyed getting to meet my wife and her family as well, and spending time together and doing all sorts of things here in the Milwaukee area and other places as well. But we never know, right? Because it's a blank spot that's left there. I do want to say one other thing, too, before I wrap this up, you know, and it has to do with the death of my dad. So my mom, before my dad died, she would work occasionally, and she did a lot of volunteer sort of things. You know, she worked for a while on, you know, weekends at J.C. Penney's in Brookfield, at the Brookfield Square Mall, and she did other things like that. But for the most part, she was a housewife. But she wasn't just, you know, content to be a housewife. She was, as I mentioned, involved in many different sorts of things, including like our soccer teams, and she was a den mother for Cub Scouts, and she did stuff like that for my sister as well with the Girl Scouts and Brownies. And she, from early on, you could actually see this by looking at the bookshelf, she knew that I was probably going to be intellectually gifted. And she had all these books like, How to Give Your Child a Great Mind. And, to her credit, she worked with me as a kid. And by the time that I was 3, I was reading. My dad handled the mathematics part. She did the, getting me to be able to read. And then they just supplied me with books and took me to the library and on all sorts of enriching sorts of field trips and things like that. My mom was also an amazing cook, as was her Aunt Therese, Tunny, who I've talked about elsewhere in another video that I'll link to below. And because my dad, when he was alive, he had a really decent job. He was a tax attorney. He'd earned both a law degree and passed his CPA. He worked for Touche Ross here in Milwaukee. Then he left so he could take a position as a chief accountant for a firm in Waukesha that unfortunately was demanding he cook the books, so he had to go back to Touche Ross. And then he died, and he was only 36 when he died. And she was only 36 when he died as well. So what you've got is, a family where the main breadwinner in what was clearly a partnership between the two of them dies, and then she had to handle all that sort of stuff herself at 36 years old. And she had some support from her family and from her college friends. Marcy Butler organized an Irish wake for my dad, but she was a widow with 2 young kids that she had to deal with. And my dad's old, broken down alcoholic father living, in our, what used to be my dad's den upstairs, and spending all of his time in the basement and staying with us. And, frankly, if it hadn't been for the, my grandpa essentially signing over his Social Security, we would have lost the house. And we had to sell off a lot of the things that we had at the time, My dad's medical expenses were significant. He'd been at the Mayo Clinic for a long time. The life insurance basically covered that. And then, with all the sorrow that she had of losing the love of her life, she had to go on and go back to work. One of our neighbors who had a office supply store in Waukesha gave her a job as a secretary and stocker. And then she kind of, worked her way from one job to another while trying to figure out what to do with her life. And then, later on she began dating again, many not great dates with people in Parents Without Partners or The Vagabonds. She was involved with a guy who became kind of a surrogate father for me, Fran, who I've talked about in another video that I'll also link to below. And then, moved on from that to date a few other people, and then finally got together with this Ron guy who everybody knew as kind of a manipulator and gigolo who I remember having a conversation with her as we were driving down from Chicago, where she'd picked me up with Ron in the car, and all my stuff down to Southern Illinois University after I was coming back from spending time in Europe and going to graduate school. And she and I were talking in French because she grew up speaking French before English, and I'm also kind of a half-ass francophone, and Ron didn't know any French, and talking with her about whether she was happy with him and whether she was going to leave him. And I remember she had this sort of view that, well, I'm in my 50s, or actually it would have been 40s then, right? I don't know, maybe she was turning 50. I don't know if I'm going to find anyone else. And I was encouraging her, of course. But, to her credit, she handled a very difficult situation of her own spouse dying, and not just from some accident, but over the course of months and months that she spent up at the Mayo Clinic. And, with 2 young kids to raise and literally, needing to earn an income to keep a roof over her head and food on the table. And, we had some pretty tough times together. So these are just some reminiscences about my mom, who was, on the whole, a pretty great person. Had flaws like everybody else, but was definitely a net positive. And, she lost her life relatively early, unfortunately. She missed out on a lot that she would have been very interested and excited to see, I think, in the course of her time. Who knows what she would have become had she lived longer. And that's it. I'll probably tell some more stories about her down the line than the ones I've already told, like about learning to cook with her and the camping trips that we've taken and things like that. That's probably enough for now to memorialize her in a certain way.